Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 11. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and this is Christian Emotional Recovery. And for this episode, we are going to talk about the connection between trauma and chronic illness. And this episode is combining two YouTube videos that have recently come out. So it's partly to promote the YouTube channel. And if you haven't, check out the YouTube channel, hit the subscribe bell. I'll put a link in the show notes because for the most part, we do have some crossovers like this one, but for the most part, the YouTube channel has exclusive content that is unique to the YouTube channel, different from the podcast. But I also do use a YouTube video every once in a while to save time. And so that's what I'm doing this time. Thank you for bearing with me. I do work an almost full-time job. And I've taken on more responsibilities from work. So this is one way that allows me to continue to put out content and also to be able to help you on the podcast as we work to grow this podcast and the YouTube channel and the platform to help more people. And God willing, maybe one day I'll be able to do this full-time or at least more of the time. And that would be such a blessing. So if you'd like to support the ministry, you can go to the show notes and there is a place called Ko-Fi, a reputable resource that you can do a one-time donation, and there's another website called Patreon that's also a reputable website where you can support monthly anywhere from $5 to $25 a month, and that is greatly appreciated. Now let's go ahead and jump right in. This episode, like I said, is the connection between trauma and chronic illness, and there's two parts, part 1 and part 2, and you'll hear me in the recording of the YouTube video, and it is a voiceover, and I did use some visuals, but the visuals were from the articles that I used. I didn't create them myself this time, so I do credit the articles. And so if you want to see the visuals, go check out the YouTube channel and you can watch the visual version there. But if not, if you listen along, you should be able to follow along with most of what is going on. So just bear with me as I go through this and you'll hear the recording in just a minute. A couple of things. It was 2 different days, so you may hear me refer to that. The first part is the connection between trauma and chronic illness in terms of showing that connection. I try to keep that brief. And the second part is how to advocate for yourself and deal with that connection, how to work on specific strategies to heal your trauma, to heal chronic illness, and to help you heal yourself as whole people that God made us to be. We can't separate our physical health from our mental health, and so that's why I felt it was important to address this topic. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, the YouTube channel. And I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and today we are going to talk about how trauma impacts chronic illness, and this is going to be the first of a 2-part series of YouTube videos. And the first one will concentrate on actually the connection between trauma, particularly childhood trauma, and chronic illness. And the second part will focus more on solutions and healing and advocating for yourself as a trauma survivor and as someone who has chronic illnesses in terms of that connection and the medical side of it. Now, this podcast and this platform and this YouTube channel are focused more on the mental health aspect of things. But as you know by now, if you've listened to any of the videos or the podcasts, this channel is strongly engaged in the science behind things, and that includes the body somatic healing aspect of healing trauma. And so we can't address the somatic aspect of it without talking about chronic illness, because most people who are trauma survivors, whether it's PTSD or complex trauma, CPTSD, we usually have chronic illness. So I'm going to do a voiceover, and I'm going to use some visuals from the articles to help us go over the connection between chronic illness and trauma. And this is such a complex topic, it could go on for hours, but I'm actually going to try to keep this very brief, and maybe at some point I'll do it more in depth. But, I just want you to see some of the basic science behind it, just the logical connection between what is called adverse childhood experiences, and keep in mind that these experiences can also be done and had in adulthood. And so if I talk about childhood experiences, you can also relate it to your adult experiences if that's been more where your trauma cycles have occurred. So keep that in mind, okay? And so this is the first part, which is how trauma affects chronic illness, the connection between trauma and chronic illness, and that's part one, and we'll talk about that actual connection. And then in part two, for the YouTube video that'll be released in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about how trauma impacts chronic illness part two, and that will be more about the solutions, about the healing work, about how that connects to helping you heal chronic illness, and about taking care of your health, and about being your own health advocate. So this is not a health-based podcast, but since we're whole human beings and a holistic approach is the only way to heal, and healing is in the body, and that's what a lot of this platform discusses, it makes sense to also talk about the connection between chronic illness and trauma. So that's what we're going to do, and how you can be an advocate for yourself. Just some basic connections and then basic solutions to that issue. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. Now, I'm going to be doing a voiceover, and I'll be showing some visuals from the articles that I've chosen so you can see. I've created visuals before myself. I'm limited on time right now, so I'm using the visuals from the articles. I will credit the articles, and they will be in the show notes as always, but you can see them in the video. Right now you may see just the cover of the podcast or the YouTube video, but there will be visuals. And if you're listening to this and it's a podcast, you can go to the YouTube channel and check out the YouTube video and see the visuals there if you'd like. So if you haven't, go ahead and go to the YouTube channel. You can get material that you cannot find on the podcast usually. And you just hit the red subscribe bell, and usually when we're in season, a video comes out every 2 weeks. And also check out the podcast if you haven't. It's linked in the show notes. And check out the Facebook group as well, and check out the store. All of that is linked below, and you can see the resources there as well. So let's go ahead and jump right in. How trauma impacts chronic illness, part one. The connection between trauma and chronic illness, part one. And so I have 3 articles, and one of them will go into each one at a time, and there's some visuals in each one. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how trauma impacts childhood. I wanted to talk a little bit about how childhood trauma impacts chronic illness, and there's so much science coming up about this. There's a lot of studies now that are connecting here. And there was a landmark study about childhood trauma, and there's a thing called ACEs, which is called Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it's a very well-known test. And back in 1998, this landmark study came out that started to show the connection between childhood trauma and other impacts, chronic illness being one of them. And so I wanted to jump straight in and show you that connection. Now, when I show you this connection, it's not so that you can be like, oh, great, well, I'm doomed. I'm just going to be sick for the rest of my life, or I guess I'm going to get a chronic illness. The point of that is not to alarm you. It's not to worry you. It's not to be negative about it. But I want to educate people on the connection. And everybody's different, and the amount of impact on everybody is different depending on their experience. And sometimes if two people have the same identical experience, how it impacts them can also be different. And there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make one person better than another. It doesn't make another person deficient. Everybody's body is unique. Everybody's mind is unique. Everybody's experience is unique. And there's so many complex factors that go into this that the connection between chronic illness and trauma is still mysterious, even though we unequivocally know there is a connection. And just because somebody has a chronic illness does not mean they experienced a lot of childhood trauma or that they have a high A.C.O.R.N score. A.C.O.R.N is the test that you can take to see your level of adverse childhood experiences. Another thing to note is that the A.C.O.R.N test is limited. It talks about a lot of the major issues that go into childhood trauma, like abuse, neglect, and toxic environments. But it fails to also talk about some issues that can also impact people, like socioeconomic issues, racism, prejudice, and other issues that can create childhood trauma and contribute to chronic illness. So just keep those things in mind as we go along. Now, this first article is the Center for Advanced Trauma-Informed Healthcare, and it's the University of California at San Francisco. And the article is How Trauma Affects Our Health. And there was a section I wanted to read really quickly just so you can see the connection. How trauma begins, adverse childhood experiences, and that was ACEs, what I was talking about before. I wanted to do visuals on this, one, to keep you engaged in the article, and since this is YouTube, I want to make sure there's visuals of some kind, and so I give credit to the article. I did not create these visuals. I did not write this. This was written by the organization that I just introduced. I don't see an author here, but that organization was responsible for this article. This is not my own work, so I wanted to note that for my listeners and for the powers that be, so to speak. So, how trauma begins, adverse childhood experiences. It says a consensus of scientific research demonstrates that cumulative adversity, meaning a lot of bad things happen to you in childhood, especially when experienced during critical and sensitive periods of development when your brain and all of that was developing, is a root cause of some of the most harmful, persistent, and expensive health challenges facing our state and nation. In a landmark study in 1998 from the CDC, that's the United States' Center for Disease Control, and Kaiser Permanente, the term adverse childhood experiences emerged to describe 10 categories of adversities in 3 domains experienced by age 18. Abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect, physical or emotional. Household challenges, growing up with a household, incarceration, mental illness, substance dependence, parental separation or divorce, or intimate partner violence. And those are among others that are not listed in this group. There are other forms of abuse, neglect, and household challenges, aka an unhealthy and sometimes toxic environment. And it says ACEs, without adequate buffering, factors such as the presence of highly attentive parent or adult can cause, quote, toxic stress, a type of stress that is so severe or prolonged that it has lasting, damaging impacts on the body and mind that are detectable as early as infancy. Sucks, right? But that's the reality of it. And this is what I wanted to show you was the visual here. Key research findings about ACEs. People that have high ACEs scores are 1.4 times as likely to have diabetes, 2 to 2 1/3 as likely to have a stroke, cancer, or heart disease, 3 times more likely to smoke, 3.2 is likely to have chronic low CPSD and stuff like that, chronic lower respiratory disease, 5 times as likely to have major depression. A lot of us can understand that. I do. 10 times more likely to experience problematic drug abuse or misuse, 37.5 times as likely to attempt suicide. Now, these statistics are not meant to scare you, and that does not mean you'll ever get any of these conditions, and definitely not all of them. It's just to show you that there is an inevitable connection between certain chronic conditions and prolonged stress, toxic environments, adverse childhood experiences, aka that can all accumulate. Now, having one minor experience is not going to do that. Having 1 or 2 points on your ACEs score is not going to do that. But prolonged trauma and a high score will contribute to these health conditions. And why is that? Because your body is in fight or flight. And when you get stressed, your body releases cortisol. And cortisol is there to help you to run or to defend yourself or to fight. Exactly, fight or flight. But when you're a child, you shouldn't be in that mode all the time. And so the high cortisol in the body stresses out your body. Your hormones are firing all the time. You've got too much cortisol and too many other things in your body you don't need. And your body's not able to be as resilient because it gets tired. And then it gets stuck in that mode because it becomes a habit. And that contributes over the long term to these conditions because, for example, cortisol doesn't help the sugar balance in your body. It affects the functioning of your organs. It affects how your brain is structured. So all those things are interconnected and connect to chronic illness. It can actually happen as early as infancy. I won't go through all that, but it does affect you starting in childhood and then into adulthood. And I wanted to read this little section here. Trauma in adulthood is also common and linked with many of the same physical and psychological illnesses as childhood trauma. More than 1/3 of women in America experiencing stalking, physical violence, and or rape from intimate partner violence, IPV, during their lifetime. That's scary. Both adult women and men can experience trauma from chronic illness, physical accidents, death of a loved one, interpersonal violence, emotional abuse, financial hardships, and more. So again, this isn't to focus on the negative, but it's not just trauma that occurs in childhood. Childhood trauma can wire somebody to be more likely to have chronic illness. Now, keep in mind that a lot of chronic illnesses can be hereditary and based on childhood ACEs scores. It's not that simple. There are so many other factors that go in, but that's one of the highest contributing factors that can turn off or turn on that propensity or that tendency for that chronic illness to manifest. Does that make sense? And so there's a lot of complex factors that go into this. And keep in mind, too, that some people may have a good childhood and then have a lot of traumatic events in their adulthood, and that impacts their chronic illness tendencies as well. So it can be both or neither or one or the other. Some people may also have a rough childhood and then maybe they marry a wonderful person and things look up for them, but they still have to deal with the impacts of that chronic childhood adversity, even when they're an adult and maybe things have looked up and gotten better for them. Okay, so there's another article here, and I wanted to this one goes on forever, but it's called Adverse Childhood Experiences and Chronic Illness, and it's Chronic Illness Trauma Studies, and I'm going to use an article from this source in the next video, the second part, that talks more about the solutions, how adversity shapes health and why it's not in your head. I love that. I love that phrase. But there's a bunch of resources here, a bunch of visuals. It talks about your ACEs score. There's a lot of resources here, so if you're interested, you can look at those. I usually read most of the articles verbatim that I put on here. I'll be honest, I have not read all this, so take it with a grain of salt. This is a good resource. It also looks like this is a good organization that does a lot of work to help people heal trauma. So I wanted you to see the connection between adverse childhood experiences and chronic illness in terms of what are the types of adverse experiences that the 10 areas of trauma. The other one only listed 3. So here they are. The ACEs. Psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, loss of a parent for any reason, not just death. It could be abandonment, incarceration, and so on. Mother treated violently. I would argue it could be the other way around too. And the other one said that women can deal with stalking and sexual assault. Men can too. So that's another thing. Substance abuse in household, mental illness in household, and criminal behavior in the household. So those are some of the things. Definitely not all of them. And definitely it doesn't have to be one of these for you to have a high ACEs score. For example, if you grew up in a house where there was a lot of yelling and a lot of chaos and a lot of screaming and a lot of fighting and people flying off the handle and throwing things, maybe nobody was ever hit. That is still not healthy. Maybe somebody in your family was abused and it wasn't you, but you witnessed that. That's still going to create chronic stress, and that's still going to create trauma. That's still going to create chronic stress, and that's still going to create trauma. So the risk of chronic illness affected by ACEs scores, they did some studies here, and 7 out of 10 causes of death in the U.S. are chronic illness diseases, according to the CDC. Keep in mind that people with low stress, as they get older, can be more likely to have some of these, like diabetes, heart disease, and things like that. It's not always things like fibromyalgia and lupus, which my grandmother had, by the way, or neurological conditions or epilepsy or things like that. It can be chronic conditions that people get as they get older. It can also be because of not good lifestyle choices, unhealthy lifestyle choices that cause obesity and heart disease and diabetes and things like that. So keep in mind that not 7 out of 10 causes of death are necessarily caused by trauma, but caused by chronic disease, which is sometimes and often caused by trauma, but not always. So it's good to make that distinction. 1 in 4 people have 2 or more chronic health conditions, and nearly 1 child in 10 is limited by a chronic disease. And it shows a chart here: lung disease, heart disease, any cancer, diabetes, and the ACEs score and how it can impact it. So it does increase the risk. But keep in mind, and we'll talk about this in the follow-up in part 2 in a couple of weeks, that there are things you can do to drastically push back and to change that statistic and push it back in your favor through healing in the body, healing your trauma. It's not just about living a better life. It's also about living a healthy life and a longer healthy life and a happy life. And so healthy eating, drinking lots of water, getting sunshine, getting some exercise, even if it's a 20-minute walk a day, stretching, meditating, praying, having a good social network, having a healthy relationship with God, healing your bitterness and your anger and your hurt and your chronic stresses through the body work as well as the mind work are all ways you can push back against this. So keep that in mind as we go along as well. Chronic diseases, it says, like childhood trauma, are difficult to see by looking at the person. And then it just goes on and talks about the connection between autoimmune, for example, and chronic disease. Autoimmune is one category of chronic illness and one of the main ones that people think about. And that's things like fibromyalgia, lupus, I'm sorry, I just don't have a lot of them coming to my head right now. Diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, they're listed down here. But it shows the connection. The risk for autoimmune disease increases with ACEs score of only 2. That's insane. That's not even that high. So who in the heck doesn't have some kind of traumatic event happen, or some mean person in their life, or some bullying, or one of these factors? It's almost impossible for somebody not to have something of these, even with the best childhood. So don't think that even people who had good childhoods got out completely unscathed, because they didn't. We've all had experiences that are traumatic as children that have impacted our wiring. So I'm not invalidating the experiences of people who have had fewer ACEs experiences, but I'm also not saying that if you have higher ones that the other people, like, there's no comparison here. Everybody is different, everybody's wired different, and how things impact people is different as well, and that's okay. It doesn't mean anybody's better than anybody else or is stronger than anybody else, but there are some people that are wired more sensitively, naturally, and I'm one of those, and they're called HSPs, highly sensitive people or persons, and this is not something that's made up. It's not some politically correct term. You can look it up as a scientific term, and there's a theory that it's a fact that it's real, but they're not really sure exactly how much of the population is like this. But it's like 25 to 30% of the population is highly sensitive. Their neurological system is just more receptive to the things that are going on. And so light and sound and trauma and noise and things like that can impact you more. You get overwhelmed more easily. But that's also an evolutionary trait to keep the tribe safe, because you are the one that would know that there's a saber-toothed tiger lurking in the bushes. You are the one that kept your tribe safe. So it's a mixed bag. Plus, sensitive people have a lot of gifts like empathy and artistic gifts, and they're just more aware of what's going on with people. They're more attuned to people's emotions and stuff. So there's both sides of that. But highly sensitive people, I believe, I don't know if there's any science to back this up, I think are more prone to autoimmune diseases and more prone to having chronic illnesses if they have a high A.C.E.S score, because that veil between the outside world and their neurological system, their neural network, their soul even, it's all connected, right, is thinner. Okay, so sometimes they have to set more boundaries to protect themselves, and that's okay, because God made you that way, and in order to thrive, you've got to do what you need to do within reason to thrive. So this risk for autoimmune disease is higher. Risk for the 80 or more types of autoimmune disease increases as A.C.E.S scores rise. Like I said, there are ways you can push back, there's ways you can heal, living a healthy lifestyle, having a good mindset now, taking care of yourself, treating your symptoms, getting to the root of your chronic illness, and trying some conventional and unconventional medicine to help you heal are all ways you can push back. So, it might be acupuncture or meditation or yoga. If you don't believe that those things are something you should do, then don't do them. There are other things you can do, like healthy eating and stretching and walking and deep breathing. There are so many things that can bring that down and help you heal, as well as doing the healing work itself. And it talks about chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And there are some fact sheets here that you can get from this organization. These are just the covers for them. But I just wanted you to see the connection between the A.C.E.S score, childhood trauma, and this also goes into adult trauma that can contribute to chronic illness. So recognizing the symptoms of chronic illness, of trauma, and impact on that, the finding of the A.C.E.S study reflect patterns commonly seen in trauma of all kinds. These effects are not limited to PTSD, but also include very real physiological, biochemical, and nervous system patterns that underlie chronic illness of all kinds. And then it just gives you more resources here. The delay between trauma and symptom onset can also be a thing, because your body is more resilient when you're younger, and as you get older, it catches up with you. There's also people that will they're high functioning, and they try to deal with all this stuff, and one day they just have a nervous breakdown or a panic attack out of nowhere, and they don't even know where it comes from, because this stuff just builds up and builds up and builds up and builds up, and they stuff it and stuff it and stuff it. It's not that they're doing it on purpose, but they're coping, and then it just comes to the surface anyway one day, because it has nowhere else to go. And that can happen in an emotional way, in a physical way. And when your body tells you something's wrong, you cannot ignore it. Listen to your body. Listen we'll talk about this more in the next episode, but listen to the cues that your body is giving you. As you learn warning signs before you get a full-fledged flare-up of something, you'll be able to pick up on warning signs and slow down, or start taking a supplement, or change your diet, or do some healing work, but intervening in every way that you can to cut down on or even prevent a flare-up of some kind if you have a chronic illness. So there's a delay here, and that's something to think about as well. And those effects can add up over time, and it's multi-generational, and it shows the increased risk of that, the portion of a problem linked to an ACE, an adverse childhood experience, and it shows you the statistics here on just different things. I'm not going to read all those out loud, but I wanted you to see the connection between trauma and childhood trauma and chronic illness, because there's science after science after science, and all the systems in the body are involved in that. There's a third article, Are Childhood Trauma and Chronic Illness Connected? And they definitely are. So in this Helpline article, this is Helpline, and this is an article written by Kirsten Schultz. This is Kirsten Schultz who wrote this. And a closer look at A.C.E.S I wanted to go straight to the third paragraph. It says another study examining trauma-informed care for survivors of childhood trauma found that those with higher ACE scores may also have a higher risk for autoimmune, same thing that the other article said, so it corroborates, such as rheumatoid arthritis, as well as frequent headaches, insomnia, depression, and anxiety, among others. There is also evidence that exposure to traumatic, toxic stress can trigger changes in the immune system. So it does impact the immune system, which is connected to autoimmune. That causes, chronic stress causes inflammation in the body, and inflammation in the body causes all kinds of chronic illnesses. And so having an anti-inflammatory diet, lowering your stress levels, taking supplements that can help you with inflammation, all of those can help. And we'll talk about that, like I said, in the next one. So it says the theory is that extreme emotional stress is a catalyst for a number of physical changes within the body. PTSD is a good example of this theory in action. And I won't keep reading, but that gives you a little bit more. What the research says is recent research outside of that CDC Kaiser study. See, they keep using that in every article because it's so impactful. It's so well researched and so respected. It's established science. But it has explored the effects of other kinds of trauma in early life, other studies, as well as what might lead to better outcomes for those exposed to trauma. While much research is focused on physical trauma and chronic health conditions, more and more studies are exploring the connection between psychological stress as a predicting factor for chronic illness in later life. For example, a study published in the Journal of Clinical and Experimental Rheumatology in 2010 examined the rates of fibromyalgia in Holocaust survivors. Wow, that's a lot of stress. Comparing how much more likely survivors were to have the condition against a control group of their peers, non-Holocaust folks. Holocaust survivors defined in the study as people living in Europe during Nazi occupation were over twice as likely to have fibromyalgia as their peers. So that sucks. But that is the reality of it. And it goes on to talk about that some more. And it talks about the limits of the ACE criteria. So it's not an absolute. It's just an indicator. And it's very strong. And it talks about the science of it more. And so I do appreciate that. And so that's a little bit about the connection between chronic illness and trauma, particularly childhood trauma. Keep in mind that this is also talking about adult traumatic events. Those contribute to chronic illness as well, even if somebody did not have a traumatic childhood. So keep that in mind. So what all this comes down to is that more and more research will come out showing a direct and indirect connection between trauma, childhood trauma, and chronic stress and chronic conditions and illnesses in the body. We already know that trauma can cause, contribute to, and or aggravate mental health conditions. It does the same with chronic conditions and even acute conditions. So for survivors of trauma, that's why it's even more important than the average person to advocate for yourself, to set healthy boundaries to protect your mental health, to advocate for your physical health, and to live a healthy lifestyle that sways our health, stress levels, and conditions in our favor. And God is our healer. God is our protector. God is our comforter. All of that is biblical. So healthy living is biblical. And so taking care of the temple and taking care of your body and taking care of your mind and doing the healing work, it's hard. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work, but it's worth it because you can get your life back, because you can prevent a lot of chronic illnesses, because you can lower the effects of a lot of chronic illnesses, and in some cases you can even heal them and cure them. In most cases you might not be able to do that, but maybe you decrease the impacts of it by 60 or 80%. That's great. Maybe it's from feeling really bad all the time to being able to function and feeling like yourself, so that's great. But we need to do everything we can for ourselves to improve our situation and conditions. Every little thing we do adds up. So next time, we're going to talk about how to do that, and we're going to go into a little more detail about that, and I'm going to use some visuals from some other articles to do so. I've already got an outline created, a loose outline. Keep in mind I riff a lot on these talks, so bear with me. But that is the connection between trauma and chronic illness, part 1. It's the first part in a 2-part series on YouTube. And this one talked about that connection. And in part 2, we'll talk about what you can do to advocate for yourself and to work on the healing work that can help you to prevent this, to cut back on this, and to deal with the issues of chronic stress and chronic illness. Okay? Thank you so much for listening. Keep in mind, click the subscribe bell to get material on the YouTube channel you can't get anywhere else. Please check out my store. If you would like to support the YouTube channel and the platform and the podcast, you can go to Ko-Fi, KOFI.com, and make a one-time contribution. It's a reputable site. Or you can go to Patreon, which is even better, and you can contribute monthly anywhere from $5 to $25. And that's greatly appreciated. It helps me to continue to do the work that I believe God has put on my heart. Thank you so much. Remember, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you dearly. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, the YouTube channel. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and today I'm doing part 2 of a series on how trauma impacts chronic illness. The first part was part 1, and if you have not listened to part 1, I encourage you, before you listen to this one, to go back and listen to how trauma impacts chronic illness, part 1, and this is part 2. Part 1 discussed the actual connections between trauma, especially childhood trauma, and chronic illness. And in this episode, we're going to talk more about healing, what you can do for yourself, how you can advocate for yourself, and the process that you can go through in order to decrease that impact, in order to heal the impacts that have already occurred, in order to advocate for yourself if you experience chronic illness, particularly connected to trauma. So, I've got 3 articles here that I wanted to go into, but first, if you haven't, click on the subscribe bell and subscribe to the YouTube channel where you can get material that you cannot get anywhere else. It's exclusive to YouTube for the most part. I do have a few crossover episodes. And you'll get a notification for every time a new video comes out, which is generally during the season that we're in, every 2 weeks. So this is part 2. The other video was put out 2 weeks ago. If you're listening to this after the fact, then, like I said, go back and check out part 1 of this series, and I'll link it into the video so you can go there, and then you can come back and listen to this because it'll make a lot more sense to do them in order. Okay, so a little bit about chronic illness. There is a link that is established that's very strong between childhood trauma, and A.C.O.R.N, which is a study that was done that's very reputable, where you can take a test, and it's adverse childhood experiences, and it's based on a specific list of different types of things like psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, adverse issues in the home like drug abuse and incarceration and chaos and things like that. So you have this score, and the higher the score is, the more it impacts your likelihood to have specific chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or diabetes and so forth and so on. But that can make people panic and freak out and be like, well, that's not fair and that sucks. And those are all understandable responses. I feel the same way. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about my own experience because I have, by the way, I'm doing a voiceover and I'm using articles to show you the impacts. Sometimes I create my own visuals, but I don't really have a lot of time to do that right now. So I'm crediting these articles. They're in the show notes. For example, this one is by Veronique Mead, and there's tips for healing chronic illnesses. And there's 2 other articles, and I'll get into those in just a little bit. So we can talk about ways that you can heal chronic illness with trauma in mind, ways that you can start to disconnect the connection between those by severing the source of the trauma and healing it, and ways that you can advocate for yourself if you are a trauma survivor, and especially a trauma survivor with chronic illness. Now, I've dealt with health issues my whole life. I've talked about them a little bit on the podcast and the YouTube channel, and maybe sometime I will talk more in detail about all the things that I've been through. And it slows down what I can do with the podcast, and it slows down what I can do with my work and trying to start a business. I've been trying, and it's not been working out, but I'm going to keep trying, and I'm going to keep working on it, and I hope that God will bless me and help me with that. And that's one reason why your support is so appreciated and so needed to keep this work going and to allow me to be able to continue to expand the podcast and the platform. But some of the things that I've been dealt with are hereditary. Some of them are neurological. Some of them are autoimmune. Some of them are hormonal. Some of them are mood conditions and disorders that most of us have, like depression, anxiety. Other people deal with things like bipolar disorder and OCD, hyperactivity disorder and attention deficit disorder and things like that. Those are things that a lot of us deal with. Some of us are neurodivergent. Some of us have conditions that are sort of crossed over between those different areas of physical and mental health in the brain. And so there's a lot of things that chronic stress and anxiety and chronic illness, there's all a connection there. So what do we do about that? We've talked about in the last episode what the impacts are. Very briefly, we could go on and on, but I'm just trying to keep this a little brief. But how can you advocate for yourself? What can you do for yourself? So first of all, there's 22 encouraging tips for healing chronic illness. This is a really good article. And this lady talks about remodeling her one of her rooms as sort of a metaphor for how the nature of dealing with chronic illness that is brought on by trauma, and how do you make it better? How do you work on healing yourself? So there are some tips here that can help you be realistic about it, that can help you have a good attitude, even though it's kind of sucks and kind of isn't fair, and how to, even make it into something that, I don't want to say can be a gift. It's just kind of icky to say that, but something where you can take that experience and turn it into something almost like alchemy, where you turn it into something beautiful. In other words, it makes you a better person. It makes you more compassionate. It makes you more aware. It makes you advocate for other people that are just coming up through the experiences you've already been through that are similar. Not the same, but similar. And she says, start with your vision, your dream of something better. First, you have to believe you can make progress in this area. She says, try, test, and experiment. So when you're trying to heal, and that's emotionally and physically, it may take some tests of medications, of devices, of different doctors, of different tests, of different procedures to see what works. And you may have to even do that within a limited budget. I completely understand that limitation, believe me. Now with chronic illness, you explore impulses. If they resonate, trust and try. Impulses here, we're not talking about like, oh, I want to eat 5 gallons of chocolate ice cream. It's more like, if you have an instinct that something could help you or work and it doesn't make any sense, I wouldn't just completely trust it, but test the waters. Stick your feet in the water and test it a little bit and see if it might be something that you need to listen to. It could be God telling you something that could help you heal. God gives us clues. He also talks to us through our bodies. Listen to your body. Also, when you're looking for treatment or a plan or anything like that, find the best fit. Enjoy signs of progress. Those are milestones. 3 steps forward and 2 steps back is the nature of this. So you may take 3 steps forward, celebrate that. And then when you take 2 steps back, be like, it's okay. I'm moving forward overall. So a lot of it is your attitude. Attitude does come into it some. Notice the sun when it starts to come in. So if things get better, if you start feeling better, really be thankful for that. Give praise to God for that and enjoy that. Revel in that. Trauma work can be hard and messy, and that's normal. So that's another thing to think about. It's not normal for there to be a straight line. It's more like you've seen the thing about progress where it's like a squiggly line moving in all these directions, but it generally moves forward. It's not linear. It can be messy. Like I said, it can be 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and then 2 steps forward and 1 more step forward and then another step back, and then so on. But it can be messy, and that's okay. Keep calm and strengthen your inner observer. Reap the rewards. Enjoy the work you've done when you make progress. Other areas of our lives are affected by this. Relationships, finances, that sucks. My finances are greatly affected by my health. If I could work full-time all the time, I wouldn't struggle financially. I'd be okay in that area. I'm okay now, but it's not where I want to be. Does that make sense? So invite resources and support for your journey. You've got to have a support system. People, doctors, therapists, coaches, friends, family, animals, anything. It can even be things to help you on the journey. Make room for self-care. Make room for self-care. You've got to be able to take the time to take care of yourself, say no, and set boundaries and do what you can do. So if you can't do what other people are able to do, that's okay. You're not them. You don't compare yourself to them. Chaos happens. I think that's kind of like the other one where we were talking about it's messy. And that's part of the process too. That's okay, especially if you're rearranging things, you're trying to figure out a new pattern for your health. It can be scary to make those changes, and it can get messy and sometimes get worse before it gets better. So you just have to kind of accept that there'll be times where there's chaos, and that's part of the process, and that's okay. I hate chaos, but yeah, you see what I'm saying. Inspire yourself with the little things. Those little things in life add up. They can help make life better. It might be enjoying a cookie in the morning. It might be petting your dog for a couple of minutes when you work in the afternoon and taking a little break and drinking some hot tea, taking a stretch and getting back to work. There are layers to healing. You've heard the metaphor of peeling back the onion and there's another layer. That's how the healing work happens. That's also how dealing with a chronic illness. You deal with a little bit at a time and it gets better and better and better. Healing trauma creates more space. The outside and the inside both change. So it's a holistic process. It's your body, your mind, your soul, all of it. Oftentimes we need help when healing trauma, she says. So, like it said, there's times where you can't do everything on your own. And if you're able to get that support professionally, do it. Do it. Okay? Trauma therapy gives us skills that we can take with us and use every day beyond just the basic healing process. Persevere. Don't give up. Discouragement happens. There are going to be times where you have a setback, maybe even a major setback. And that's normal. We're human, she says. And that's true. For example, I have had issues with my neck, and it affects my vagal nerve, and it causes all these symptoms, and I've had shooting nerve pain, which is absolutely terrifying. And I was getting back. I went to physical therapy. I went to see a special chiropractor that works on the atlas, which is that top bone up in the top of your head that kind of leads the rest of the... Basically, what happened was I got back in alignment and I got better for a few months. And then I had a major blowout and some of this stuff returned. And now I've been having all these symptoms for like 5 weeks. But I've been slowly getting better by experimenting and finding new things and using some of the old things that work for me. So you will get discouraged. You will have setbacks, but you cannot give up. 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but you're still moving forward. And then it makes a difference. The lady that wrote this, her health is still improving. So she's talking about her own journey, but I think it's helpful to see other people's experiences to know that you can get better and that it is possible and that healing is possible. To connect with other people that are going through this journey is absolutely invaluable. It's absolutely invaluable. So just a couple of ones that I wanted to look at here. Number 1, especially, was start with your vision. So you have to start somewhere. And when seeking to reduce symptoms of chronic illness, we start with a belief that healing at any level is possible. You've got to believe it's possible. Since chronic illness is incurable by its very definition, this often means we have to forge our own paths, sometimes against our doctor's beliefs. I'm not telling you to do anything against your doctor's beliefs, but you've got to be your own healthcare advocate. So take that with a grain of salt. But yeah. And then the next one I wanted to really look at was number 6, which was notice the sun when it starts to come in. So when things do get better, when you're starting to reap the rewards of your hard work, when you heal chronic illness by addressing trauma-based patterns in the nervous system and throughout our bodies, it takes time. It can take longer than you think it's going to, but when you see progress, even a little bit, celebrate it, enjoy it, emphasize it, and appreciate it. And then 7, like I said, it can be messy. And I think it kind of goes with the part about there can be chaos. So we don't have to address every single little trauma we've ever experienced, she says, and that's true. In order to begin to heal, reaching a tipping point is all the body seems to need for its innate ability to recover, to emerge. That's true too. There's still a lot of dirt to look up when we're working with trauma as a significant as symptoms as significant as chronic illness. So you can't skip over the messy bits. You got to clean up the mess. It sucks. You didn't make the mess, but there it is. And so that's part of the healing process, going through the pain, the grief, the loss, the fear, and doing a little bit at a time. Doing it in a safe space, doing it with boundaries, doing it contained and healthy in a balanced way. And then another one here that stood out to me was number 12. Number 12, make room for self-care. I can't emphasize this enough. Self-care involves things, she says, like saying no when we don't want to say yes, getting enough sleep, eating in ways that feel good, meditating, doing yoga or stretching if you don't do yoga, having lunch with friends, working out and exercising in gentle ways. Maybe you can do vigorous exercise, maybe you can't. That's another thing you need to test yourself and talk to your doctor. But do things that make you feel good, that are healthy, that are not sinful, that are good for you. Not overspending your spoons. If you know what the spoon theory is if you have chronic illness or mental health issues, you have a certain number of spoons every day you can spend. That's how you spend your mental and physical energy. And you may have fewer than the average person. And once they're gone, they're gone. So be very careful with your spoons. Don't be scared to spend them if you need to, but be discreet in how you spend them, if that makes sense. 19 was the last one I wanted to look at, and that one is trauma therapy gives us skills we can take with us and use every day. Whether you're working with a therapist or you're doing your own healing, somatic body work, or mind work. It says you won't always need a trauma therapist, and you won't always need to work as intensely, as often, or with another's help. So there does come a time where you hit a tipping point, and it gets a little easier. You always need to do the healing work, but maybe not as much. And you have fewer chronic conditions and symptoms. It says healing effects of trauma teach you many skills that you can carry forever. Mindfulness becomes as much a part of you as breathing. You learn to recognize triggers and begin to anticipate flares, prepare for them, figure out how to recover when they happen, or even prevent them. I've been able to notice things in my body and be like, whoa, I've got to slow down for a couple of days, or I'm going to sleep a long time tonight, or I need to start taking that supplement again, or I need to cut caffeine for a few weeks. Those cues, if you know them, once you know them, listen to them and trust them and follow through on whatever it is. And it says your witness helps you understand events that might otherwise be stressful. So it's about mindful observing. You gain more capacity to resource and regulate your reactions. Healing trauma isn't just hard work and moving through the layers. It's also an investment that keeps on giving in the best possible way. And that is so true. And so a little bit about that's things that you can do to help you to heal chronic illness and heal trauma with chronic illness in mind. And there's another article here called Creative Arts Therapy Source. And it talks about how to heal trauma, how to heal when you have childhood trauma related to your chronic illness. And I'm just going to read, this talks about the ACEs scores. We've already gone through that in the last video, part 1 of this. So let's talk about how to heal when you have childhood trauma. And it talks about things you can do to help you heal are, 1, you can educate yourself. And so know the connection between trauma, ACEs scores, and chronic illness. Learn about your chronic illness, but let me tell you something. When I was going through some of my worst symptoms, I had some serious flare-ups where I was basically in the bed most of the day. I could get up for a few hours for a couple of months at a time, and I would slowly get better as my body homeostasis kicked in. Whatever the flare-up was from, I still don't have a diagnosis, but it would slowly start to regulate. But I would start reading about all this stuff based on my symptoms and being paranoid that I had all these terrible conditions. So you need to educate yourself, but please, for the love of all that is good and holy, do not get on WebMD and obsess and think that you have these terrible diseases. You will actually make your chronic stress worse. So educate yourself, learn a little bit at a time, but don't obsess over it and don't start going down those rabbit holes. Do not do it. Walk away. I don't care what you have to do. Do not do it. Don't go down those paranoid rabbit holes. Okay? Tell me you're not going to do that right now. Okay? It is bad news. I went there and it was terrifying. And I would shake and I would cry and I would just think, oh, I have this terrible disease and my life is over and I don't even know how I'm going to tolerate this. And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't turn out quite as bad as that. And you still take it one step at a time no matter what. Take care of yourself is number 2 here through this process. And some ways you can do that in self-care: mindfulness and meditation, healthy eating. So it's about lifestyle choices, not just the mind stuff, not just the body stuff when it comes to healing trauma. You're a whole person, a holistic approach. They're doing so much research now showing that Chinese and Indian medicine was right to begin with. They don't believe in the body and the mind as separate things like Western medicine. They believe that the body and mind are one thing and they're inseparable. And I agree with that. And I think that that's wise. And there's science backing that up more and more every day. So healthy eating impacts your chronic illnesses and your mind. If it affects your body, then your body also affects your mind. It goes both ways. It's a cycle. Regular sleep patterns, stress management, quality social time, daily exercise and physical activity, even if it's just going for a 10-minute walk, even if you can only walk to your mailbox, even if you just sit outside and listen to the birds for a half an hour a day, anything helps. So don't feel bad if you're not going to the gym and sweating for an hour a day. You don't need to do that to be healthy. You take a 15-minute walk every day, you're increasing your health in so many ways. You're getting sunshine, and you're getting hearing the birds sing, and your change of environment, and you're moving, and you're getting fresh air. And there's just so many benefits you can't even begin to understand how many there are because it's so subtle. Hobbies and interests, relaxation techniques. While you don't want to disassociate with addictions, having things that keep your mind occupied in a healthy way, there's a time you need to tune in with yourself, but there's also a time to stay busy. And if you're not able to work because maybe your chronic conditions are that cumbersome, if there are simple hobbies that you can do, even watching a movie, something to keep your mind occupied can be healthy. Keep a journal is number 3. You can keep track of your triggers and responses, what you've learned, solutions. So that will help you to understand when you start to have a flare or the progress that you've made so you can see that progress. So you understand your body. Also keeping a journal with your emotional stuff and doing journal prompts that help you heal trauma. There's free ones all over the internet. Those are all helpful. Lean on your support system. You have God. Not all of us have a great family and friend support system, but find the support system you can, whether it's a therapist, a coach, your pet. It might be nature, it might be God, it might be an online healing group. So there's a lot of free support groups out there as well. You might join a support group like Celebrate Recovery, A.C.O.R.N, Adult Children of Alcoholics. You don't have to be a child of an alcoholic to still get help because it's the same healing process, okay? And therapy is another one. Art, music, and just listening to music. If you aren't able to do a lot of like physical stuff, like play the trumpet or play the flute or play the piano or the guitar, if you can't do stuff like that, then you could listen to music. You could sing if you're able to sing. There's a lot of things you can do. Dance if you're physically able to dance. Do art. There's a lot of strong studies and there's programs where people heal their trauma through these expressive ways because you can get parts of your soul and your mind and your experience out in a way that you can't through words and through therapy and all that. And the last part of this whole puzzle is you've got to be your own health advocate. This is absolutely related to trauma and how it affects chronic illness because there are so many doctors out there that won't believe you. They'll tell you it's all in your head. They'll invalidate your symptoms. And you've got to find a doctor who will listen to you. You've got to find a doctor or a healthcare advocate who believes you. You've got to find one who's willing to try unconventional methods. And you've got to find one that is trauma informed, at least on a basic level. And so that's hard. I know it's hard, but being your own healthcare advocate, this is in WebMD. This is by Susan Bernstein. And it just talks about what is a health advocate, and they take control of their healthcare experience. You and your doctors make decisions as a team. You speak up with your questions, needs, and concerns. If you feel like, oh, well, I'm being aggravating, or I'm being annoying, or I'm asking for too much, you need to be, of course, be reasonable, but you need to speak up. If you have questions, needs, or concerns, or preferences, tell your doctor. And if you try unconventional healthcare methods, just be careful with those. But if that's what, like, there were times when conventional medicine didn't help me. And so I saw a cranial sacral massage therapist. I've seen one of those. I've seen an Atlas orthogonal chiropractor, which is kind of cutting edge. It's science-based, but it's not very well known. And I've seen a lot of specialists and holistic practitioners, and sometimes they've helped me better than doctors. Now, I'm not saying don't use science, medicine, and doctors. You need to see a doctor if you have a health condition. But it can be hard to find a doctor, so just keep looking and advocate for yourself. Build a doctor-patient relationship. Be open and honest with your doctor. Be honest about your symptoms, your prescriptions, your medical records, your family history, your drug allergies, and over-the-counter medicines, and all the stuff you're taking. Do your health homework. Like I said, study your research conditions, symptoms, but don't go down a rabbit hole. Ask questions if you don't understand something. Your diagnosis, your treatment options, anything that your doctor suggests, ask them for an explanation in a clear, simple way. You might ask them, it lists some, I won't go into those, but your treatment options, tests, risks, side effects, success rates, medical terms, and so on. If they suggest certain treatments, ask about the cost, the coverage, the pharmacies, or whatever the case may be, and talk to your doctor. Even if this is a holistic person, you would still do a lot of these things. For example, introduce yourself to your doctor or nurse or your practitioner and let them know what your name or nickname is you prefer. You would do this with a therapist as well. Ask for help in your native language if your doctor's office has an interpreter. Okay, Make eye contact when you talk. Let doctors know if you have any hearing or vision problems. Listen while they explain your diagnosis, and then ask the questions, and ask how to contact your doctor's office with questions, insurance matters, medicine refills, and to schedule follow-ups. So even though these are practical suggestions, you need to be your own healthcare advocate. And there are times when your doctor will not have an answer. That will be frustrating and scary. They've done everything they can, but you are not. That does not mean you've exhausted all of your options. You might need to see a specialist in another area. You might need to see a different therapist. You might need to consider some holistic options. And do those carefully, and do those with the advice of a licensed medical professional, okay? That's not a substitute for going to see a doctor. But I do understand the frustration of finding a good doctor. I understand the frustration of having a chronic illness you cannot diagnose. I have one, and it's not been diagnosed. And I understand the conditions that can cause you to be laid up in the bed for days, weeks, or months, or parts of days every day. And so please know that you're not alone in this. Know that you can be your own advocate and that it's okay to speak up. Know that it's okay to set boundaries and take care of yourself. And know that you can love other people. And if you have good people in your life, they will understand if you're doing your best. And you can also take these experiences and help other people who are going through similar things and support them as well. This isn't just about what we can do for ourselves. It's about what we can do to take this experience into the world. Once we learn more about our conditions, once we are able to manage our conditions, then we're able to help other people in similar situations. And that's such a blessing. It's such a blessing. That's what I'm trying to do here. And so this whole talk is about the connection between trauma and chronic illness and how you can help yourself. That's what part 2 of this talk is about. And I hope that this has helped you and given you some specific guidelines, suggestions, and tactics, strategies to help you do that. Thank you so much for listening. This is part 2 of a 2-part series, and this is a YouTube video. And thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Remember, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.